They once called him a hero of France, a knight of glory who fought beside Joan of Arc, honored by the king himself with the highest of titles. But behind the banners and medals was something darker, something no one dared speak of. Beneath his castle, they found a hidden chamber. A scent lingered there, old, metallic, unnatural. And inside were objects so small, so fragile, that few could bear to look at them closely. This isn't folklore. This isn't a tale told to frighten children. This is the transcript of a real trial. One of the most disturbing court proceedings in medieval European history. And at the center of it all stood a man once adored by his country, now accused of crimes so taboo, the church itself feared they could shake the heavens. He had everything power-land legacy. But something drove him to the edge. Some say it was grief. Others claim madness. But the records suggest something far stranger. Alchemy, forbidden rituals, whispers of things no soul should ever invite into this world. And as you'll see, the horror didn't come from war or famine. It came from within stone walls, from behind banners of nobility. If you're the kind of person who finds truth stranger than fiction and darker than myth, then stay with me. Because this story only gets deeper, more twisted, and more unsettling from here. And if you want more forgotten histories that were never meant to resurface, go ahead and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Because this is just the beginning. France in the early 15th century was a kingdom teetering on the edge. The 100 Years' War between France and England had ravaged the countryside. King Charles VII had only recently secured his crown, and much of northern France remained under English occupation. Cities were crumbling. Feudal lords fought their own private wars, and a deep spiritual unease crept across the land. This was not just an age of war. It was an age of whispers of heresy, sorcery, and fear. The people believed that the devil walked among them cloaked, not in shadow, but in silk and armor. It was a time when power and darkness often shared the same throne. And into that world was born a child of staggering wealth and lineage. His name was Gilles de Rais. He came from the Montmorency-Laval family, one of the most powerful noble houses in France. When Gilles was just a boy, both his parents died, suddenly leaving him with vast lands, immense fortunes, and a legacy shaped by blood and inheritance. His grandfather raised him not with tenderness but with cold calculation. Gilles was trained in Latin theology, swordsmanship, and classical philosophy. His education was that of a ruler, a tactician, a man destined to command. In his teenage years, Gilles was married off to a wealthy heiress, not for love, but to combine estates and strengthen political alliances. By his early 20s, he controlled multiple castles, his own militia, and enough influence to rival regional princes. And then came war. In 1429, a teenage peasant girl named Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, appeared at court claiming divine visions and demanding to lead an army. Gilles de Rais believed her. He fought alongside her at the Siege of Orléans, one of the decisive battles of the 100 Years' War. He rode at her side as they marched to Reims, where Charles VII was crowned king. For his bravery, Gilles was awarded the title of Marshal of France, one of the highest honors a military commander could receive. At the height of his fame, Gilles was a national hero, a knight of faith, a man of intellect, and a symbol of patriotic courage. But that glory was not to last. When Joan of Arc was captured and burned at the stake in 1431, something inside Gilles shattered. He withdrew from court life, abandoned his military duties, and retreated into his own world. A world filled with excess mystery and eventually something darker. He poured his fortune into art theater and elaborate private performances. He employed actors, musicians, and set designers to build spectacular productions within his castles. But behind the scenes, rumors began to swirl. It started subtly, servants who vanished, guests who were never seen again, nights filled with strange lights and distant screams echoing through the woods, around the Château de Tiffauges. And still, no one questioned him. He was a noble. He was above suspicion. But then he began to seek out something far more dangerous than art, alchemy, the occult, the promise of forbidden knowledge. He invited mystics, magicians, and self-proclaimed sorcerers into his home. He was said to be obsessed with summoning entities that could grant him power, wisdom, and wealth. Letters discovered later described rituals and exchanges, strange offerings in return for even stranger promises. The language was vague, coded. But one phrase repeated the purest gift. What that gift meant, no one could say for certain. At the same time, disappearances continued. Quiet, unremarked. A boy from a carpenter's family in Nantes. A shepherd's son from Machecoul. A servant sent to Tiffauges, who was never seen again. Still, Gilles remained untouchable. His lineage protected him. His title insulated him. And no one in power dared move against him. Until the day he went too far. He crossed a line not even nobility could protect. An act not of whispers or shadows, but of open defiance. And suddenly the whispers became accusations. The castle gates that had long concealed his secrets began to creak open. Investigators arrived. Witnesses were summoned. And the legend of Gilles de Rais, Marshal, a France comrade of Joan of Arc, began to fall apart. The story was no longer about a brilliant but eccentric nobleman. It was about something far more terrifying. A man once revered by a nation, now accused of committing the most unspeakable crimes known to medieval society. And as history has shown us, not even a crown or a title can protect someone from the weight of truth. There was no announcement, no trumpet of doom, just whispers, quiet, persistent, and terrifying in their consistency. At first they came from servants, that Lord Gilles had grown strange, that he no longer dined with guests or rode through his lands, that children boys sent for service, apprentices singers would enter the castle, but never leave. Then came the rumors from the villagers, a washerwoman who noticed bloodied garments discarded near the woods, a priest who received a tear-streaked confession from a mother whose son had been promised work at the chateau only to disappear. No one spoke too loudly. After all, Gilles de Rais was no common man. He was nobility, a former marshal of France, a man blessed by kings and God alike. At his estate in Tiffauges, the castle loomed like a forgotten cathedral, vast, fortified, but hollow in spirit. Gilles withdrew further into isolation, surrounded only by a handful of fiercely loyal retainers. He funded strange pursuits, alchemists from distant lands, astrologers who claimed they could summon divine forces, men who whispered secrets in forgotten languages. Something had shifted inside him. He became obsessed with what he called the eternal transformation. He wrote letters later recovered asking scholars about ancient rites, lost rituals, and hidden forces that could restore his fading power. In one, he spoke of a gift so pure it could summon angels or bend demons. The language was poetic, but chilling. At the same time, the pattern of disappearances continued. Not loudly, not with torches and screams, but steadily. A young boy from Nantes helping his father deliver goods was never seen again. A shepherd's son vanished while tending animals near the woods. A page was sent to Tiffauges and simply disappeared. The names were ordinary, their absences passed off as misfortune or misadventure. But one by one, the silences began to add up. Yet still, no one dared accuse him. To challenge Gilles de Rais was to challenge an institution, his name, his family, his legacy. Even if the air around him grew cold, even if the priests avoided his estate, even if the villagers lit candles every night praying their own sons would return home safe. It might have gone on for years longer had he not made a very public, very dangerous mistake. In the spring of 1440, Gilles de Rais committed a single act that shattered his wall of protection. During a dispute with a clergyman over a minor land disagreement, Gilles stormed into a church and forcibly removed the priest from sacred ground. It was not the most serious thing he'd ever done, not compared to the whispers, but it was public. It was bold. And most importantly, it was sacrilege. He had crossed the church. Immediately, Bishop Jean de Malestroit of Nantes launched an official investigation, not into the church altercation, but into everything. Land dealings, rumors, accusations. For the first time, those who had once whispered in fear were invited to speak aloud. And speak they did. Servants from Tiffauges testified that the Lord held ceremonies behind locked doors. A stable boy recalled hearing crying from the cellar at night. A cook claimed that deliveries of meat and wine were far smaller than the number of guests supposedly staying at the estate. Then came the more harrowing stories. A former chamberlain, trembling under oath, spoke of being asked to clean up after unexplained incidents. Another witness claimed he had seen books handwritten by Gilles himself, describing dark summoning rituals. A priest recalled being invited to bless a chamber, only to find symbols on the floor he could not recognize, drawn in what he believed was animal blood. There were no bodies, no physical evidence the court could hold up. But there were patterns that pointed to disappearances, secrecy, and obsession. And for the medieval church, that was enough to move forward. A warrant for Gilles' arrest was issued. In September 1440, soldiers arrived at his estate. He did not fight. He did not flee. It's said that when he saw them, he simply nodded and asked them to wait until he finished dictating a letter. He was taken to Nantes, placed under ecclesiastical custody, and tried before both a secular court and a tribunal of church officials. At first, he denied everything. He laughed at the charges. He called the witnesses liars. He accused the Church of Envy, the nobles of betrayal, and claimed the investigation was a plot to steal his lands. But as the trial progressed, as testimony after testimony echoed the same disturbing themes, something in him broke. His closest associates, trusted aides who had stood beside him for over a decade, began to confess. Not with bravado, but with horror. They described their roles in the rituals, their silence, their guilt. Whether coerced or genuine, their words painted a picture darker than anything the court had expected. And Gilles began to listen. After a night of prayer with his confessor, he requested a private meeting with the bishop. What was said in that meeting remains unknown. But the next morning in open court, Gilles spoke. He admitted to turning away from God. He admitted to seeking forbidden knowledge. He acknowledged the harm he had caused, not in graphic detail, but with a kind of sorrowful abstraction, as if the pain was too great to name. The courtroom was silent. Some wept. Others sat in stunned stillness. Even the judges, hardened by years of legal work, seemed shaken. He was sentenced to death the following week. But he was granted a rare privilege. He would be allowed to confess before the public and face his end as a penitent, not a criminal. What remained of Gilles de Rais was not a monster, not a nobleman, not a warrior. He was something else entirely, a broken man, an unsolved question, a soul standing between history and myth, between guilt and redemption. And his death would only deepen the mystery. The days before his execution passed in solemn silence. Gilles de Rais, once a celebrated knight of France, now sat behind stone walls, not as a prisoner of war, but as a condemned man waiting for death, not on the battlefield, but on a wooden scaffold. There were no more outbursts, no more denials, only quiet prayer and long hours spent with his confessors. The Church granted him access to spiritual advisors. Not out of mercy, but because the nature of his crimes and his status required a performance of repentance, public redemption, a final act of contrition in front of a city that once hailed him as a hero. The trial had shaken everyone, not because the evidence was irrefutable. Much of it had been testimony, speculation, and implication, but because the image of Gilles, bent before the tribunal, voice trembling as he asked for forgiveness, was not that of a monster. It was of a man crushed under the weight of his own unraveling. In one of his final recorded statements, Gilles said he had strayed too far from God in pursuit of knowledge power and a kind of eternal legacy. He said he believed he could overcome the limits of man, that he could command forces beyond understanding. He wept, not just for what he had done, but for what he had become. To some, it was a genuine plea for forgiveness. To others, it was a calculated performance by a brilliant mind trying to salvage some dignity before the end. But no one left that courtroom unaffected. The sentence was confirmed: death by hanging, followed by cremation, both acts to be carried out in public. It was meant to erase his name, cleanse the stain, and serve as a warning. And so a place was chosen, not a battlefield, not a cathedral, but a low plain near the banks of the Loire River, where the earth was soft enough for gallows, and the wind could carry away the ash. A space not for judgment, but for finality. The morning of October 26, 1440, arrived cold and windless. Crowds gathered before dawn, not with stones or curses, but with hushed voices and downcast eyes. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a kind of funeral, not for a man, but for a myth that had rotted from the inside. The gallows stood tall, simple, and unadorned. Nearby, a pyre of wood had been prepared. Once hanged, his body would be burned. No grave, no monument, just smoke and memory. When Gilles de Rais arrived, he was dressed in a white robe embroidered with a cross, the garments of a penitent, not a criminal. He walked slowly, flanked by priests. His hair was neatly combed. His hands were not shackled. He asked for no mercy. At the base of the gallows he knelt. He hugged his confessors. He asked for forgiveness, not from the crowd, but from God. Then he stood, looked into the sky, and climbed the steps. The noose was placed around his neck. The executioner adjusted it carefully. No shouting, no last speech, just a breath long and deliberate, and then silence. When the trapdoor fell, the crowd held its breath. It is said the moment lasted longer than anyone expected. That the wind didn't stir, that the sky, clouded and pale, offered no sign. His body was lowered onto the pyre. The flames were lit. They consumed him quickly, but something lingered in the air. Not the smoke, not the smell. The question: was he truly guilty? Some said yes, the testimonies, the letters, the ritual markings. Others argued that the church had long feared men like him, powerful, eccentric, hard to control. That his confession was coerced, his trial manipulated, and his death politically convenient. The truth, like ash in the wind, was hard to grasp. But what remained was the ending. Public, complete, and absolute. A man once anointed by kings who had ridden beside Joan of Arc, now reduced to whispers and shadows. His castles abandoned. His name struck from noble records. His legend warped into warnings. Children were told stories, not of his victories, but of his fall. Parents whispered his name like a curse. Priests used his tale as a sermon about pride, temptation, and the danger of walking too far from the light. Yet others mourned, not for the crimes, but for what was lost. A brilliant mind, a fearless warrior, a man who once believed in saints and somehow found himself chasing demons instead. What caused that fall? Was it grief, madness, or something no one dared write down? No one knows for sure. But his death, public, solemn, unforgettable, became part of France's collective memory. A wound, sealed by time but never forgotten. And to this day, the name Gilles de Rais sits at the edge of legend, a cautionary tale carved not into stone but into silence. After his execution, Gilles de Rais was buried not in a noble tomb, but in memory fractured, fearful, and incomplete. His name was stricken from many family records. His estates were seized or abandoned. His titles dissolved. The castles where he once ruled fell into ruin. Some were left to rot, others dismantled stone by stone. By the end of the century, there were almost no official mentions of him in France's court archives. It was as if history itself had flinched and turned away. And yet he was never truly forgotten. In whispered folktales, his name lived on. In Brittany and the Loire Valley, mothers warned their children not to stray too far from home, lest Bluebeard find them a grim nickname that some scholars believe was inspired by Gilles, though it would later become a fairy tale in its own right. Writers in later centuries would revisit the case drawn by the same questions that still haunt us. Was Gilles de Rais truly guilty of the horrors laid at his feet? Or was he a casualty of his time crushed by superstition, political convenience, and his own unraveling mind? In the 19th century, French poets and philosophers re-examined the trial. Charles Baudelaire, Joris Karl Huysmans, and others saw in Gilles not just depravity, but tragedy, a fallen angel. A man who once believed in sacred visions only to be consumed by doubt and desire. They explored him not as a monster, but as a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of ambition, grief, and spiritual hunger. In modern times, Gilles de Rais became the subject of books, plays, documentaries, and debates. Some portray him as a psychopathic killer. Others paint him as a misunderstood noble, undone by political rivals and religious paranoia. A few go further, still suggesting he may have been innocent his trial, a fabrication, his confession, the result of torture, or psychological collapse. We will likely never know the full truth. What survives are fragments, court transcripts, letters, contradictory testimonies. The raw material of history shaped as much by fear and imagination as by fact. But perhaps the most unsettling part of Gilles de Rais' legacy isn't what he did or didn't do. It's what his story reveals about us, about how quickly society can elevate a man to sainthood and then cast him into oblivion, about how power, when left unchecked, can curdle into something unrecognizable, about how sometimes the darkest tragedies are not found in monsters, but in men who were once revered. Gilles' life is a cautionary tale, not just about sin or ambition or madness, but about what happens when brilliance is unmoored from morality, when faith becomes obsession, when grief goes unanswered. He died nearly 6 centuries ago, and yet his story continues to echo, not because we want to remember him, but because we can't seem to forget. Perhaps we're not meant to. He was once a knight of France, a hero beside Joan of Arc, and yet centuries later, he is remembered not for his battles, but for the questions that still burn through the silence he left behind. Was he a monster hiding in plain sight, or a man lost in grief, destroyed by a world that no longer needed him? We may never know. But one thing is certain: the story of Gilles de Rais is a reminder that history is never as clean as the statues we build. It's complicated, chaotic, human. If this story gripped you, you're not alone. There are more tales buried beneath centuries of dust and denial, stories of kings and queens, of betrayal and vengeance, of justice twisted by power. If you're ready to go even deeper, watch this next video. They burned her as a witch. But what was she really hiding? It unpacks a trial even more mysterious, and possibly even more unjust. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because sometimes the most disturbing truths are the ones history tried hardest to forget, and we're here to uncover them one story at a time.